I was feeling very stressed by that time about our lack of intimacy, so I went forward and prayed, and I asked God to show me if he was gay or not. Well, within a month of that prayer, he was arrested for being caught with a teenager in a homosexual act.
Welcome to Pure Passion. I'm Jonathan Daugherty. I'm your host for today's show. You would think that as a young lady who was brought up in the ways of the Lord, having kept yourself pure until marriage, and marrying a man studying to be a pastor would be so in God's will that you'd have the perfect marriage, right? Well, that's what today's guest thought too, until she discovered her husband was attracted to men. Carol Wagstaff, Executive Director of Living Stones Ministries, shares her story with us. If you have a spouse or other loved one with same-sex attraction, you don't want to miss this episode.
I met my husband in college, and immediately I enjoyed him because he had a great sense of humor. He was very well liked among the student body members, and we became friends first, and he made me laugh a lot. I noticed that he was not as passionate as the other guys I had dated, and I believed that it was because he was going to be a minister. He was studying to be a minister. I think the reality of homosexuality did not really come to me until after we were married. It was very difficult for him to be intimate with me, and the time between our sexual experience got longer and longer. He had stayed to work on his master's degree. I had finished school, and he began to spend a lot of time in the men's dorm at the college. And we'd have guys over at different times, and that putting together with the lack of intimacy in our relationship, I began to put two and two together. We left college to attend seminary. And while we were there, in an evening service, church service, they invited people to come down and pray about issues that they had. And I was feeling very stressed by that time about our lack of intimacy, so I went forward and prayed. And actually, one of the seminary professors where he was attending came and prayed with me. And I disclosed to him that I was concerned that my husband might be homosexual. It was with that news then, a couple of days later, that was on a Sunday, I think it was either the next day or Tuesday, they called him into the office at the seminary, and they said, you know, if you're homosexual, we need to find out if this is true. So they sent him to a psychologist. It was within a couple of weeks that we got the report back. The psychologist said I was perfectly normal and my husband wasn't gay. That was the end result of that. And so I took that internally as something's wrong with me. Why doesn't my husband love me? Why doesn't he respond to me the way that other guys had responded to me in college and earlier? So it was very confusing to me. We had been invited to participate as pastors in this church he had as youth pastor. And we moved to that location, which was up in Oregon. It was then that we decided that we would get counseling at that point. We had counseling with 3 different counselors, none of which knew what to do in our case. Then it was a surgeon in the church where we were serving who had done some lay counseling that decided to try to help us. So he helped us for about 1.5 years, and then he finally said to me, I'm sorry, I can't do any more. I don't know what else to do. Your husband's not cooperating. And I was devastated. I was ready to walk out of the marriage at that point, and my husband said, please be patient with me. I'll try to get help myself. I can handle it myself. Now, bear in mind that I still did not know that it was homosexuality that I was dealing with because he never named it. The counselor never really named it. It was almost like a sexual dysfunction kind of thing. So we continued with him. When he said he no longer could help us, that's when I began praying, God, show me, is he really gay or not? What's happening here? And it was within around a month or maybe a little more, that he was arrested one night, and it was one of the kids in the youth group. And to this day, I don't know why those parents, I never did talk with the parents, never knew their reaction to what happened. But he was so well loved and revered in the church that I think they just accepted it. And an attorney in the church, with the cooperation of the pastor, got him out of jail that night. And he said, I need to tell you I was arrested tonight for being caught in a homosexual act with a minor. And all I could think of was the prayer that I had prayed that God would show me that that was true. And I said to him, were you in a homosexual act with a minor? And he said, his response was, I wasn't doing anything wrong. Now, I was naive and codependent enough that I assumed that he was not gay, that was a lie, that the police officer had lied about what had happened. And so at that point, I said, thank you, Lord, he's not really gay. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Never understanding the rationale behind his answer till much later. Never asked him another question, turned over and went to sleep. He went to bed. In the weeks that followed, he started hanging out with a very handsome young college student who was not involved in our church or had anything to do with our church at all. He spent a lot of extra time with him. Several months went by. Finally, everyone in the church was noticing this relationship. And the pastor, in the meantime, was talking with me on the side, finding out what was going on. And one night, my husband, who had a youth night at the church on a Tuesday night, was in the gym, and he was helping, spending time with the kids. But that night, a secretary in the church confronted him and said, people are talking about you. They're saying you're homosexual. And he said to her, if that's the case, I'll do something about it. So he sat down that night to a typewriter, not a computer, but a typewriter. And he wrote a letter to the pastor, and he said, if you think I'm gay, I'll leave. And he gave it to the son of the pastor to carry home to the pastor. The pastor took the letter to the personnel committee the next day. This was on a Wednesday. And they asked him to leave the church by the weekend. This took place in the 70s. And the homosexuality was not tolerated at all at that point in time. To think of somebody serving the church and struggling with same-sex attractions, it just didn't exist. So what happened, the same attorney who got him out of jail, the personnel committee met with me, and they said, there's no hope. He's got same-sex. This issue, meaning homosexuality, is not something that changes. So you just need to move on with your life. And the attorney that got him out of jail filed our divorce papers. And so we determined that we would move to Southern California, the two of us. He would go his own way, and I would take our one child that we had at the time and become a single mom. When my husband finally told me that homosexuality was his issue, I was devastated in a new way. I had already been devastated by the loss of my marriage to him, but I loved him very much. There was no lack of love on my part, and I felt so angry at God for a while. I thought, Lord, I've kept myself pure. I wanted to be married to a pastor, believe it or not. And I was devastated when I found out that this was his issue, and why did God allow for this to happen to me? My son was 7 when our marriage broke up. And I was advised at that time by a psychologist not to tell my son that he was gay. That it would be too much for him to handle at that age. And I think it was the right decision. He was coming into those tender years, and I did not tell him what was going on with his dad. So he lived with me. He would visit his dad from time to time. And then one night when he was 17, and he was in bed, and I'd come in to tell him goodnight, and he said, Mom, why did your marriage break up with Dad? And I said, are you ready to hear the real reason? And he said, yes. And I said, your father is homosexual. And he couldn't accept it. He wouldn't accept it. And he just argued with me, and I said, well, I can't argue with you, son. This is what I know. Well, from the age of 17, then until the age of 24, he never really knew from his father that he was gay. He married young at the age of 19, and his father invited he and his wife down to Baja for a weekend. And at that point, he brought his partner with him, and he revealed to my son that he was gay. It was very devastating to my son. My husband went on to live homosexually, and for the next probably 15 years, he lived a homosexual life. And I remember by that time, his son, came to me one Christmas season. I was out in the garage in my home looking for Christmas decorations. And my son came in and said, Mom, I need to tell you something. He says, Dad has AIDS. And we just, both of us, held each other and cried. Because even though it had been a long time since we had been married, I still cared deeply for him and was so sad to hear the news that he had AIDS. And at that time, they didn't have the great medications that they do now. So he took the medications, but they were pretty awful. And he died it was about a year and a half later that he died of AIDS. I've been in ministry now for almost 19 years, working with families that have homosexuals in the family, and mostly parents, wives, children of gays. And I realized that I never would have known the pain that they experience had I not gone through it myself. If I had to go back again and I found out that that was my husband's issue, I would sit down with him and I would say, honey, I'm sorry you have this issue. I'm sorry it's something you have to deal with. And I understand it's not that I'm not directly responsible for it. So let me work with you. Let me help you. Let me know how to help you to deal with it in your own life, because I love you and I want to remain faithful to you. I look back on my situation with my son, being 7 years old and not knowing and not wanting to reveal to him. And I realize that in today's culture, children are much more aware. They see it on TV, they see it everywhere around, and they may or may not associate that with a parent. But they're much more savvy than my son was at the time. But I think I would sit down with my child and talk with them and just talk about, your father and I have some issues that we're needing to work through. And we just want you to know that it has nothing to do with you, because children internalize that rejection and they feel abandonment. So I would make sure that the child knew that it had nothing to do with them and that we were going to need to work on these issues. And if you notice some things, you come to mommy or daddy and we'll talk to you about it. I think I would handle it that way. My son, when he learned that his father was gay, he went through a period of time thinking that that might make him gay, and that he might also, because the myth that it's something that you're born with is very strong. So he went through a time of questioning himself and wondering if he was gay. And I've found that true of other children. I had a woman that I counseled for a while who was the daughter of a gay man, and she felt that she might be gay because of what had happened with her father as well. So it's not just the same gender that have that issue. But definitely there is a time, I would say that is the primary issue for children of homosexuals. They question their own sexuality. And if they don't get some definitive explanation or understanding, they can go away with that, and it can get them into the life. It could possibly get them into the life themselves. I believe that there's a point at which children are struggling with, I either love my dad and walk away from God, or love God and walk away from my father. I think the key that I have found even in ministering to family members is to help them understand there are very real issues behind the homosexual struggle. So to help them understand that they can love their dad and love God, they don't have to reject one to reject the other, and still learn to love both and live in a way that even though the parent, I remember one of the men particularly, was very angry with his father because his father was out and proud. And it bothered him a lot to even be with him because he hated that attitude. But over time and in time in working with him and helping him understand, he was able to finally get to the point where he could love and accept his father and still not abandon the faith. But that's a very real struggle for a family member. I believe that when you are deeply wounded, that Satan can take very much advantage of that, because then out of that woundedness comes unforgiveness and bondage, satanic bondage. And I believe that the person who is dealing with that first has to deal with their own feelings, the reality of their anger. I went to God and I told him how angry I was. Now, I don't know as a child if I would ever have felt that I could do that. But God knew anyway that I was angry, so I might as well tell him how angry I was. So I did tell him. And what's interesting in my journey was that God showed me that I had to sacrifice my anger and my hurt to him, which is how I learned to take advantage, or take the hurt that I had experienced. I would process that, I would cry, I would scream, I would yell at God, whatever. And then I would go to him and say, okay, God, here it is. I'm not going to carry it anymore. And it's yours. I know that if I keep this in my heart, I will go into bitterness and unforgiveness, and I refuse to do that because I love you. I knew what it would happen to me. So I gave it to him and just let go of it and trusted that God knew what the future held. And that's how I handled it. Because if I had kept that anger and lack of forgiveness in my heart, I wouldn't be sitting here today. I could never have done ministry. If someone feels something is unforgivable, I try to help them do what God did to me. And that was when I was being so judgmental about my husband. God kind of held a mirror up in front of myself, and he said, okay, let's look at your life. Let's see, now how about this situation? Did you act like a Christian then? Or what about this? And God showed me my own life. It was like my own life was laid before me. And I could see that I had issues, never been able to see them before. But it was in that state of God revealing the truth of my own life, my own pride. Oh, my stars, I was so prideful, it wasn't even funny. And I had been raised as a goody. I was a goody two-shoes, and I had been raised in a highly educated family. And so I carried that with pride. And God had to show me how hollow all of that was, and how I was a sinner just like anyone else, like a homosexual or anyone. And so God was able then to reach me and reach my heart and show my heart to me. Now, that didn't happen overnight, I have to tell you. It took a lot of years. And some of them, even after I started the ministry. God, my process, I say to people sometimes, I probably had more changes in my life than I've ever helped anyone else, because God began to show me my own heart and how black my own heart was. And so it was in that process, and that's how I work with families, to help them understand the humanness that we all have, and how God has the pride that we carry, the ego that we carry is so prominent in us. And so many times I see in the families, it's not that they have empathy for the gay son or daughter, but they're looking at themselves. What will people think of me? How will I tell my family? You know, we've been a good Christian family. We've gone to church all of our lives, and here our son's coming out as gay. So the hurt and anger that they feel is probably against God, number one, for not protecting their child from this when they've kept a stellar life. But the focus is more on what's happening to me than what has my son gone through that's brought him to this point. It's very difficult for parents to understand that you can love your child and not approve of the behavior they're involved in, or the life that they're involved in. I find that parents have a very difficult time with that. Loving a child, to many parents that I've dealt with, is accepting whatever they do and approving of it. And finding out how to love that child unconditionally and still not approve of their behavior or approve of what they're doing or their life is very difficult. So that's the one issue that I find a lot of parents try to deal with. And they find it very difficult to do that. So boundaries are very difficult. Knowing how to say, I love you, but this is my home. This is how we will live within my home. If you choose to live that life, then that's not something that we're going to be able to go along with. That this is your life. We understand you're an adult now, and if that's your choice, that's good, but that's not something we will ever approve of. And I usually say to parents to make sure that they tell their child they will always love them. The light's always on. We always love you. You're always welcome in our home. But we will never approve of that lifestyle. God has something so much better for you than this. I have known two couples specifically where the husband repented and came under help, and their marriage has remained. They've remained together. It's been a happy marriage. I don't think the struggle is entirely gone by the husband, but they've been able to work it out, and it's been a good thing. It's been a wonderful thing for me to see, particularly with the history that I have had in my own life. The secret to the restoration of a marriage is the recognition of the person who struggles. This is not just feelings that I deal with, but to recognize that God sees it as sin. So while I may have a struggle with my temper, and I have to learn how, with the help of God, to resist my temper and to learn how to live. A person who struggles with same-sex attractions has to accept that this is something God doesn't want for me, and be able to repent of that and say, I want to follow God no matter what happens. And learning how to cope with that in themselves and in the marriage is difficult. It's not easy. But I do see successful cases where that has happened, and it's been a wonderful thing. In dealing with the couples that I have where homosexuality was present, I think the most important thing is the spouse to realize it is not their fault, but to realize that this is an issue that they are going to have to lean into God and to trust in the Lord. I often tell wives that I deal with, I cannot guarantee your marriage will be saved. But what I can tell you is that if you lean into the Lord and trust Him to lead you, and not keep your eyes fixed on your husband and how well is he doing, and is he over this, but letting God guide you in the relationship and change you so that you can learn how to live with it, because God is faithful. He will take care of you. He will take care of you whether the marriage survives or not if you remain faithful to Him. So the spouse has to get over their anger, number one, at their husband and at God for bringing them into this situation. And then they have to begin to understand the issues behind it in order for them to remain faithful to that marriage. But the key is really resting in the Lord and growing spiritually. I think my own life, even though my marriage did not survive, God had to show me so many things about myself. And I really had to rest in Him and trust Him to take care of me, even though I no longer was married. And that has to be true in case of the spouse. They have to let go of controlling their spouse, but to remain faithful to the Lord first and get their cues from the Lord, not from their husband or wife.
What great insights and practical advice from a godly woman committed to helping others through what she's learned. If you have a loved one in the homosexual lifestyle, please know that you're not alone. Don't let shame isolate you and keep you from seeking others that have walked these steps before you. Carol Wagstaff's ministry, Living Stones, is just one of many across the country available to you today. Are you thirsty for the love of God as displayed through His saints like Carol? In John's Gospel, Jesus said, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the Scripture said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." Seek Jesus. Ask Him to be Lord and Savior of your life, and be thirsty no more. I'm Jonathan Daugherty for Pure Passion.